number of nuclear warheads in the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union today is approximately 50,000. If just 10,000 of these, equal to 300,000 times the power of the bomb that fell on Hiroshima, were to be used now in a total nuclear war, all life on Earth will be faced with extinction. More than 100 scientists from around the world assisted in the development of this program. Among them were Dr. Soichi Iijima, the president of Nagoya University in Japan.
If a nuclear war were to break out, what would happen to mankind and to the Earth? This is a matter of deep concern to me as a Japanese doctor, connected with Hiroshima and Nagasaki for close on 40 years.
British nuclear physicist Dr. Frank Barnaby.
The nuclear weapons now being deployed by both the Americans and the Soviets are seen to be more useful for fighting a nuclear war than deterring one. Nuclear weapon technology is inexorably leading to a first strike capability. Nuclear deterrence is dead and buried.
Dr. Anatol Rapoport, professor of peace studies at the University of Toronto.
I would say that as each country adds to its arsenal, both the probability of the war and its severity definitely increase. For one thing, with regard to accidental war, it was quite a revelation to me to know that there are literally hundreds of false alarms that occur each year. And the rate of these false alarms increases from year to year by something like 30%.
Christopher Plummer. There are many good reasons for believing that the probability of a nuclear world war is ever increasing. More and more countries are becoming capable of producing nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons in the hands of those less concerned with the consequences of such a war may well lead to a crisis situation, a first strike, and global nuclear war. One country, Japan, has already experienced the horror and devastation of a nuclear attack in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More than 200,000 died instantly or within weeks from fatal injuries. For those who survived, the scars left from radiation burns, the cancers and leukemia are still today a cruel reminder of the terrible power of nuclear weapons and the mass devastation that they can cause. Yet the bombs that fell on Japan were small and insignificant when compared to the weapons that are poised and ready around the world today. Much of the background and content of this program comes to us from the people of Japan, with the hope that we will not unleash such a nuclear nightmare ever again. In the next 90 minutes, we will see a vivid illustration of global nuclear war and of the world that will be left after it. On the 16th of July, 1945, at Alamogordo, New Mexico, the hot, dry desert sands gave birth to the world's first atomic bomb. Little Boy, the uranium-type atomic bomb used on Hiroshima. Fat Man, the plutonium-type atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. These two bombs were taken to Tinian, an advanced air base for Allied strikes on Japan, before the results of the Alamogordo experiment were fully understood. On the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, just 3 weeks after the very first test, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It exploded 580 meters above the city. Everything directly below the fireball at ground zero boiled in the white flash and intense heat to the accompanying roar of the explosion. Buildings within a radius of 2 kilometers were destroyed by the blast. The entire city was soon engulfed in a deadly sea of flames. 3 days after Hiroshima was annihilated, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki with equally devastating results. The number who died before the end of the year was estimated at 140,000 in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki. Yet 90% of all the deaths occurred within 2 weeks of the victim's exposure to radiation. Immediately after the war, the United States sent in large investigation teams to carry out extensive studies. There were many questions to be answered. What incredible energy shattered these buildings? What intensity of thermal radiation was responsible for leaving the permanent shadow of this valve on the wall behind? How did heat and radiation affect those who were unable to seek shelter? And what were the relationships between color, materials, and thermal radiation? Here, although the white shirt was unaffected, the victim's face was badly burned. For those who lived through the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the terrible power of the atomic bomb soon became evident. Cancers and leukemia resulting from exposure to the invisible but deadly radiation affected nearly all the survivors in one way or another. Although the awesome energy of the atomic bomb had been demonstrated to the world, America and the Soviet Union began testing an even more powerful device, the hydrogen bomb, just 7 years after Hiroshima. The first hydrogen bomb test was conducted in 1952 at Bikini in the Western Pacific. The explosion was of such magnitude that lethal ash rained down on nearby unsuspecting islanders and fishermen.
On the 1st of March, in the general vicinity of Bikini Atoll, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, a tuna fishing boat, out of Yaizu in Shizuoka Prefecture, was hit by lethal ash from a nuclear bomb test. The 23 members of the crew were affected and have developed symptoms of radiation sickness.
For the Japanese, this was their third nuclear experience. The deadly ash that rained down on the Lucky Dragon fell 167 kilometers away from ground zero. 28 Americans and 236 inhabitants of nearby islands were also taken ill with radiation sickness. The strength of the explosion was said to have caused surprise. In Operation Q, the code name for a series of tests begun in 1955, buildings were constructed at various points from 2 to 4 kilometers from ground zero.
Here at the Atomic Energy Commission's Nevada test site, I covered the story of Operation Q, a program to test the effects of an atomic blast upon the things we use in our everyday lives.
The atomic bomb used in this test had double the force of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Dummies were exposed to direct thermal radiation and the effects of the shock wave.
Observers without goggles must face away from the blast.
At the time, nuclear tests were regular events, happening at almost weekly intervals.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Every sort of structure, from ordinary houses to industrial facilities, was tested in experiment after experiment. The shock wave and violent winds lift and scatter the debris. Wind speed is nearly 250 kilometers per hour. Extensive tests were conducted by producing shock waves which passed through a 50-meter tunnel to strike full-size targets. The pressure produced by this blast is about 2.5 tons per square meter. On the scale of the Hiroshima bombing, this is equivalent to the force of the blast 2 kilometers away from ground zero. In the first half of 1957, 30 nuclear tests were carried out.
Nevada Test Site, 1957.
Pigs were used in experiments because their skin is similar to human skin.
These are protective shelters and underground free field measurements in high overpressure regions, basic effects in rugged terrain, radiation problems, especially neutron activation in soils, biomedical effects, individual field tests.
Pigs still living, writhing in agony from the effects of the searing heat, are hit by the powerful shockwave and the violent rush of wind that follows. Of the 710 pigs used, only 2 were still alive 1 month later. The soldiers who were involved in the simulated battle conditions became the objects of studies by scientists. The long-term effects of exposure to radiation for these soldiers is still a matter for debate. Fallout shelter tests were particularly numerous in the 1960s against the background of national anxiety that built up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Their emphasis was on whether a large number of people could actually survive during and after a nuclear war with only a limited supply of materials and space at their disposal. Some tests lasted as long as 2 weeks, and the number of people who took part in the shelter programs throughout this period reached a total of 30,000. One major problem became evident in nearly all the shelter studies: how to deal with the heat generated by human bodies. The Fallout Shelters Manual, published in 1984 by the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, deals with the increase in body temperature.
Item number 1217. If a large number of people are confined to a shelter with no provision made for the removal of heat or for ventilation, temperature and humidity in the shelter will rise rapidly, producing a charged atmosphere.
This is Newport, Rhode Island. A course on fallout shelter management was held here at this hotel in the spring of 1984.
Survive, and we're going to go through a living experience of about 14 days. 14 days.
This course and others like it still draw upon 25-year-old research data from the 1960s shelter study program.
We're getting 5/10 of a ranking.
Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. A shelter large enough to hold 4,000 people lies in the center of the city, 30 meters beneath the church of Santa Clara. Construction of the shelter began in 1954, during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and was completed 6 years later. This is the lower opening of a ventilation shaft. Air is drawn from ground level to here through ducts, and then into this cooling room for lowering the temperature of the air. By passing through these layers of stones, much of the heat is removed. Next, the still warm air passes through filters which clean it of fallout ash. This large machine produces ice which forms on the surface of a drum and is broken up by the action of automatic hammers. Air is then passed through the ice and drawn into the living quarters of the shelter. This massive system is intended to enable those in the shelter to survive for 2 weeks. But no one knows how functional it may prove to be, if ever needed. In the mountains near Freiburg, close to West Germany's border with Switzerland, there is a shelter of a different sort. It is the only shelter in the world devoted to preserving the cultural inheritance of a nation. Placed inside cylindrical steel capsules are microfilms of historical documents such as diaries and books written by people who have left their names in German history and the international treaties Germany has concluded. But will there be any humans left alive on Earth to open the capsules? And if they are ever opened in the distant future, will they be of any use?
If we are far enough away from ground zero, a shelter may offer a chance of short-term survival. In a global nuclear war, any large city can expect at least a 1 megaton bomb. 1 megaton is 70 times more powerful than a bomb that erased the entire city of Hiroshima. In all the tests of nuclear devices and the detonations of the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their power and their devastation always exceeded predictions made by the scientists involved. The facts and figures used in this program are also conservative, so the effects of a nuclear war may be far worse than any predictions we have made. In any event, the results could well mean the end of all life on Earth.
The thermal pulse generated by a 1 megaton bomb reaches approximately 5,000 degrees Celsius at ground zero and moves outward at the speed of light. Even concrete and bricks and hard steel melt in an instant. Immediately following the thermal pulse comes the shock wave. In a modern city, shattered window glass becomes a horrifying rain of death. People would be hit by a storm of glass fragments blown from high buildings. In major cities around the world, at mid-afternoon on a warm, sunny day in July, the population density is at its peak. Stores are filled with shoppers and tourists. Children are enjoying their summer vacations. The streets are crowded. And office towers filled with workers. A 1 megaton warhead detonated above such a major population center would vaporize everything in a flash of light. In 1977, the United States government published a book, The Effects of Nuclear Weapons. Details from this book were used to create the following simulation. The focus for this simulation is Tokyo, because of its large population, its industries, its communications, and transportation network. A 1 megaton nuclear warhead explodes about 2.5 kilometers above the city. A detonation at this height produces maximum destructive power. In Tokyo, at exactly 2 p.m. on an average weekday, within a 5-kilometer distance of ground zero, there are an estimated 50,000 train commuters and 3,500 cars on the expressways. Hotels and temples, gas and oil storage tanks, nearby high-rise buildings, shopping districts, and residential areas. A little park that is to become ground zero echoes with the cheerful shouts of children. Suddenly, a gigantic fireball, almost 2 kilometers in diameter, appears in the sky, and the thermal pulse sears the ground. The shock wave at ground zero exerts a pressure of 20 tons per square meter. Buildings are crushed and pieces scattered. Then a powerful wind with incredible speed tears at anything left standing. Lines of cars burst into flame as they are hit by the thermal pulse and blast wave. Belts of fire run through the city streets. The center of Japan's political and economic life is swallowed by an enormous ball of fire and utterly destroyed. In other major cities such as Toronto, New York, London, and Moscow, the same scenes of death and destruction will be repeated over and over. The heart of a city, directly beneath Ground Zero, will be vaporized in an instant. Everything facing Ground Zero bursts into flame in the white flash of the thermal pulse. Seconds later, the shock wave strikes. The glass skin of the buildings is blasted into fragments and driven by tremendous winds with speeds of 400 kilometers an hour. Thousands of tons of shattered glass showers down upon anyone caught in the open. Within 5 kilometers from Ground Zero, there will be complete destruction. At a distance of 10 kilometers, the thermal radiation still has the power to ignite anything that it touches. Fuel storage facilities are a necessary part of any large city. Often located near shopping areas, houses, and schools, these are within the city boundaries. When these are struck by the thermal pulse, the energy released by 1 million tons of fuel is equivalent to several nuclear explosions. The eruptions and searing fireballs add to the deadly rain of nuclear destruction. During the working day in the larger cities of the world, there are several 100,000 people within 2 kilometers of the city center. They will be killed instantly. Within 20 kilometers, there are several million people, and only a small fraction of them could expect to survive. These projections are based on a single 1 megaton bomb. But in a nuclear war, many warheads will be fired at each target. Today, the number of nuclear warheads throughout the world is 50,000, but this number is increasing by more than 1,000 each year.
3, 2, 1, mark.
The American ICBM Minuteman III, traveling at 20 times the speed of sound, it can cover the distance between America and the Soviet Union in 30 minutes. To match this, the Soviet Union has 2 missiles, the SS-18 and the SS-19. A nuclear attack target map. The circular zones shown with blinking lights are the areas constantly patrolled by missile-carrying submarines. The yellow marks show the positions of missile storage and submarine bases. This 500-meter high tower is an antenna for the Very Low Frequency, or VLF, communication station at Northwest Cape, Australia, an American military installation. In very low frequency communication, radio waves as much as 70 kilometers in length are sent from this antenna by an extremely powerful transmitter. This type of VLF communication is a reliable method for sending coded messages to submarines at sea, and is therefore of critical importance to present-day nuclear strategy. Kariya City in Aichi Prefecture, central Japan. 8 towers at regular intervals rise high above the rich farmland. Formerly the Japanese Imperial Navy's Yosami Wireless Station, it is now a United States Navy communications facility. From the network of towers at Yosami, communications are maintained with nuclear-powered submarines in the Pacific area. For the United States, Yosami is a highly important facility, ranking with 3 other American bases in Japan at Jadina, Misawa, and Yokosuka. The green lights blinking on and off show communications facilities, which, according to military strategists, would be among the first targets to be attacked.
I think we just targeted Western Europe.
William Arkin is the director of the Arms Race and Nuclear Weapons Research Project in Washington. Arkin and his staff work out the positions and importance of military installations, which would be designated as targets in the event of a war. The number of such targets worked out by Arkin's team amounts to 7,600 for the United States and the USSR combined.
The importance of bases like Yokosuka and Yosami needs to be understood in the context of current defense strategy. The United States is now deploying new Trident missiles and submarines to the Pacific. So the importance of very low frequency transmissions in the Pacific increases significantly as the worth of the submarines in the Pacific also increases.
Nuclear-powered submarines have become of strategic importance to war planners today. This is the USS Ohio, the most advanced of America's nuclear-powered submarines. It carries 24 missiles with a total yield of some 20 megatons. One missile has 8 warheads at its tip and a range of 7,500 kilometers. The Ohio can thus strike at almost any area in the world and can aim at 192 targets simultaneously.
You have to understand that the target lists on both sides hold tens of thousands of potential targets.
Dr. Richard Turco, Research and Development Associates, California.
Targets. But the major targets, for example, in the United States and Soviet Union, comprise the missile silo fields, the strategic bomber bases. In other words, the strategic military bases are certainly the prime targets. And then, of course, there's always the final blow that's considered, and that's the direct targeting at the city centers themselves, purposely to destroy the other guy's civilization. But then there are secondary military bases that have tactical significance. In Canada, there are the radar nets, the early warning systems, communication nodes. There's a strategic St. Lawrence Seaway, for example. Many of the international airports in major cities are also potential targets. Bombers can land there and refuel and take off again. Canada is the first line of defense of North America. Britain is in its own right a nuclear power. It has its own nuclear forces and therefore poses a direct threat to the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc. Of course, West Germany and the other Western European nations would probably be in the front lines of any major conflict.
In Germany, where both East and West camps are in direct confrontation, there is always the feeling that nuclear war is close at hand. As a result, volunteer organizations called civil defense groups have formed in the cities and towns. Approximately 10,000 members in 244 groups meet and rehearse activities such as emergency medical procedures, firefighting, rescue, and communications. Volunteers are responsible for measures to be taken against contamination caused by nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. But these organizations and exercises are based solely on the assumption that a nuclear war would be a limited one.
The nuclear arms race has entered a very dangerous stage. It's not just in the numbers of new weapons that are going to be built, it's in the new ways of using nuclear weapons, devising...
Dr. Sergei Plekhanov, head of the Political and Social Studies Department, Academy of Sciences, Moscow.
The problem is that if a nuclear war is fought, then somebody will assume that there ought to be a victory in nuclear war, and nobody would like to be the loser. And there will be always a temptation on the side which fears that it is losing to use a higher caliber nuclear yield, thus inviting, you know, a travel to the next ladder of the escalation. The more we know about the effects of a large-scale nuclear war, the clearer it becomes that there will be no post-nuclear world. We have a responsibility to the world which we have inherited. Look, we are the first batch of people on this planet that have enough tools to destroy everything on it. Global nuclear war is a synonym for nuclear suicide. There is no better way of putting it.
The estimate of nearly 8,000 U.S. and Soviet targets may very well be a low estimate. Nor would a nuclear war spare countries outside the two great military alliances, since most of them are seen as belonging to one camp or the other. When the first nuclear missile thunders into the sky towards its target, the final chapter of man's rule on Earth will have been written. Nuclear war is not a natural disaster. It is a horror that man can choose to experience or prevent.
If a total nuclear war were to break out at this moment, and if the United States and the Soviet Union used just 20% of their nuclear weapons at points across the world, the total energy released would be 400,000 times more powerful than the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. These horrifying images would become reality all over the world. Those who had escaped the thermal radiation and the blast in shelters far from the points of detonation would eventually begin to experience difficulties.
Page 102, Section F of the Fallout Shelters Manual. When, as a result of exhalation, humidity goes up to 100%, and should room temperature rise to 35 degrees Celsius, a number of people will lose control. A further rise of 6 degrees will cause a rapidly increasing number of deaths.
These simulations are not from the pages of science fiction or wild fancy, but from facts based strictly on scientific assumptions. It is a fact that military experts believe that 20 to 50% of the world's arsenal of 50,000 warheads would be used in a global nuclear war. Therefore, 10,000 warheads should be understood as the minimum number that will be used. Michael Crepon, director of the verification project, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Washington.
Well, if there is a global nuclear war, the globe is going to become radioactive. Everybody is going to be affected. Allies of the participants as well as the direct participants themselves. I think most military strategists, especially military strategists who have seen the results of nuclear test explosions, and civilians who have seen nuclear test explosions, understand that the use of these weapons in war will have devastating effects. And they understand that war is not a very neat paper and pencil exercise, that wars can get out of hand, that there is chaos on the battlefield, and that you cannot use nuclear weapons and think that you can control the course of that war.
Law and order disappear. Political and social systems collapse overnight. But this is by no means the end of the story. Those people who escaped to shelters underground will finally have to make a decision, whether to go out into the open or to wait for their end where they are. Food, water, and even air will be exhausted. This condition could be reached within days. The heat generated by the bodies of those in the shelters will accumulate and begin to exceed the limit beyond which life is possible. The population of the cities in the industrialized countries of the Northern Hemisphere is 1.3 billion. Of this number, 1.1 billion are dead. The deadly effects soon spread around the world. After a nuclear war, rain falls, a black rain like crude oil. A horrifying rain, strongly radioactive. Anyone exposed to it will develop severe radiation burns. In Hiroshima in 1945, rain began to fall soon after the bomb was dropped. For about 3 hours, a torrential downpour fell on the northern and western parts of the burning city. Then ash falls over the ruined cities. Lethal ash, intensely radioactive. If the ash touches the skin, it causes severe radiation burns. If it is breathed in, it continues to emit radiation, causing leukemia and cancers.
It is now almost 40 years since the time that the bombs fell in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In that period of time, we've known many complications of the exposure to the nuclear radiation.
Dr. Howard Hyatt, Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health.
The people who were badly burned have never recovered fully from the physical effects, despite, in the instance of many, repeated surgical operations. The people who were exposed to radiation, many have died in much larger than expected numbers from leukemia, from cancer of the stomach, cancer of the lung, cancer of the thyroid, cancers of other kinds. I suppose nothing quite matches the emotional problems that these people, and as I understand it, a very large fraction of these people continue to carry with them. Many say, even now, that their lives have been changed in ways that they can't describe and that will never revert to normal.
The city of Hiroshima in the summer of 1984 is now a busy regional center with modern buildings and green spaces. But the 40 years that have passed since the day of its destruction have been hard and cruel for those who survived. Under the shadow of the city is the Peace Memorial, one of the few buildings left standing in 1945. Mr. Susuma Yonida, 5 years old at the time, was exposed to radiation, together with his mother and his cousin. They were 1.5 kilometers from ground zero.
Yesterday, my cousin died of cancer, which was probably caused by the atomic bomb. I've just come back from the funeral. She was 44, the same age as me. I don't think she ever imagined it would happen like this, more than 30 years after the bombing. Her body was bleeding, and she was in pain when she died, and her hair was coming out. She died in the same way as so many of the others who were hit by radiation, and I feel it's a warning to me, too. My mother died at the age of 59. It was December, 10 years ago, 29 years after the bombing. I nursed her. She was a patient woman. She was in pain all over, but she bore it. Blood kept oozing out from different parts of her body. You'd wipe it, but it'd come out again no matter how often you wiped it away. She died a miserable death. She really suffered for a whole week. But she'd suffered a long time before that. She really tried to get better, but she couldn't beat the bomb in the end. I suppose it'll be my turn next.
At Hiroshima University, 50,000 clinical records and 600,000 X-ray photographs are kept in the Radiation Medical Research Center. This is a pathological specimen room. Specimens of the internal organs of people who died as a result of the atomic bombing are carefully labeled and preserved. There are more than 6,400. Fever, headaches, dizziness, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of hair, piercing pain, bleeding that cannot be stopped, and before long, stiffening of the body, and eventually, death. This is the typical course of acute radiation sickness. This long-term agony was caused by the radiation released within the first second of the bomb's detonation. The fireball created sucks up huge quantities of highly radioactive earth and dust. The heavier dust falls back to Earth soon after the explosion, covering an area that will extend as far as several hundred kilometers downwind. But the finer, nearly invisible particles of dust rise up even higher into the stratosphere and spread around the world. The dotted green lines show the paths of the radioactive fallout if an all-out nuclear war were to break out in Europe. Nuclear explosions would occur in an instant all over Europe. Dr. Henning Rodhe, Stockholm University, Sweden.
Now, in those areas that are most seriously hit, particularly Europe, North America, and maybe the Japan region, the doses could go well above 100 rad, and that's at least 1,000 times higher doses than the natural levels of radioactivity would produce. Another important fact is that the radioactivity in the fallout will remain for months and years after the war.
The flow of particles would vary considerably according to the weather conditions prevailing at the time, but it would eventually lead toward Eastern Europe and the USSR. If the war also included North America, the fallout would soon blanket the continent and eventually drift towards Europe. Any discussion on the spread of fallout from nuclear warheads must also include the likelihood of attacks on nuclear power stations. Nuclear reactors contain large amounts of long-lived radioactive isotopes like strontium-90 and cesium-137. And if these were released into the atmosphere, it would make huge areas uninhabitable for a very long time. And in war, the main objective is to maximize damage to the enemy. There are over 300 nuclear power plants in operation in the world today. The United States has the largest number, 82. Canada has 13 in operation and 11 under construction, 35 in the Soviet Union and 35 in Britain, 36 in France and 27 in Japan. If the core of a nuclear power plant with its concentrated radioactive fuels is destroyed, the fine particle fallout that results will be extremely deadly for a long time. The following shows the dramatic results when nuclear reactors become targets. First, the fallout pattern 1 week after an accident has leaked 1/3 of the radioactivity from a typical nuclear reactor into the environment. The ellipse indicates the area in which people will receive at least 2 radiation units, or REMS. 2 REMS is more than 20 times the normal background level of radiation. Secondly, this is the pattern 1 week after a 1 megaton nuclear warhead explodes at ground level without striking the reactor. Now the combined effect. 1 week after a nuclear warhead vaporizes the nuclear reactor with the same 2 REM ellipse pattern. In each of these 3 examples, we assume that a light westerly wind is blowing at 24 kilometers per hour. Clearly, the destruction of nuclear power plants in a war would add enormously to the radioactive fallout which would settle across the countryside and affect everything it touches. Not far from New York is the experimental forest area of the Brookhaven National Research Laboratory. Dr. George Woodwell, director of the Marine Biological Laboratory at the Woods Hole Research Facility, carried out an experiment here on the effects of radiation. A quantity of cesium-137 was placed in the center of a stretch of virgin forest and left there for 18 years. During this time, the surrounding vegetation was subjected to continuous, strong radiation. The experiment began the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis and ended in 1979. The objective was to determine the effect that a nuclear war would have on an ecosystem. In the first 6 months, the giant oak and pine trees perished. Next, the shrubs died out, and finally grasses such as sedge disappeared. What had once been thickly covered woodland had now become a desolate patch of sandy ground. Only lichens and mosses survived. In eastern Japan, a similar study is being conducted at the irradiation nursery of the Central Agricultural Experimental Station. The nursery is surrounded by a high embankment, and the way in is guarded by heavy iron doors. A radioactive isotope, cobalt-60, has been placed in an iron tower in the center of the nursery, and plants are cultivated all around it. Those nearest the tower receive the greatest exposure to radiation. This is the section where experiments are being conducted on wheat. Seeds were sown in November 1983. 6 months later, it should have been time to gather in the crop. But the seeds that had been sown nearest to the tower never sprouted. They had all died. Where the daily dosage had been 135 rems, the plants had eventually appeared, but on close inspection looked like this. Many of them showed abnormal development. Leaves were curled, and some heads contained no seeds. This wheat received 55 rems a day, but here again, development was not normal. Leaves were crooked, heads were light. In this section, research is being done on trees. It is some distance from the iron tower. Even plants that receive low doses of radiation over a long period don't escape the effects of their exposure. A plantation of mulberry trees, green and fresh. At first sight, they seem perfectly normal. But when we look closely, we see that the branches are flat, like wooden planks. This clump of Japanese cedars is a good distance from the iron tower, but the trees have been exposed to radiation over a long period of time. They are now slowly dying. The white tips of leaves, looking as if they were made of wax, stand out clearly among the green. With their cells destroyed by gamma radiation, the leaves have lost the ability to produce chlorophyll. The Japanese and Woods Hole experiments clearly demonstrate the fatal effect a nuclear war would have on crops the world over. Studies are also being conducted on the effects of radiation on animal life. These salmon eggs were fertilized, then divided into 5 batches. Each batch was exposed to a different level of radiation, from 10 rems at the minimum level to a maximum of 500 rems. Two months later, the effects of the radiation are very noticeable. Some eggs have failed to hatch. Some young fish, or fry, have died of exhaustion after hatching. Some have survived, but among these, there are many that are abnormal. Fry with crooked backbones. Abnormal fry were conspicuous among those who had been given 50 rems or more. Those who had been given 250 rems or more all died. One of the very obvious characteristics of a very young fish is its large eyes. Here is one born without eyes. The physical damage suffered by this blind fry was the result of exposure to 50 rems. Dr. Richard Turco.
The post-war environment will be an extremely hostile place for man for quite a few reasons. First of all, the direct explosions themselves causing enormous casualties, destroying the infrastructure of our economic, medical, and civil systems. Scientists are extremely concerned at this time and propelled high into the atmosphere by those explosions in large numbers will change the climate of the Earth for a period of time extending from months to years perhaps, causing severe after effects that will fundamentally affect the way people could survive in the aftermath of a nuclear war.
In a total nuclear war, the world's oil installations would go up in flames, one after another. Approximately 1 billion tons of oil fuel in the industrialized countries would burn, putting 500 million tons of smoke into the atmosphere. And in the cities, combustible materials such as buildings, asphalt paving, and oil products would burn, releasing 1.5 billion tons of smoke. The forests of the northern hemisphere would contribute a further 300 million tons of smoke. The total amount of smoke from all sources in a nuclear war would be nearly 2.5 billion tons, of which 180 million tons would be pushed even higher into the stratosphere. Once in the stratosphere, smoke particles are held aloft by the upper air currents for a long time and prevent much of the sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. It would change the climate of the Earth. Dr. Turco.
The amounts of smoke and dust that are presently projected for a war of 10,000 detonations or more are so large and so unprecedented in magnitude that it seems very likely that the climate of the Earth will be affected. This because the sunlight will be attenuated in the atmosphere rather than reaching the surface of the Earth.
I would like to...
In December 1983, a public forum was held in Washington. The subject was the climate after a global nuclear war. Scholars from both the United States and the Soviet Union were invited to attend. Dr. Vladimir Alexandrov, a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, presented the results of research done in the USSR.
Minus 20 or something like this. In January, it will be something minus 40, minus 60 Fahrenheit.
The results obtained by the scientists from both countries, working with their different methods, pointed to the same conclusion: the world would freeze after a nuclear war.
Over Saudi Arabia, up to minus 50 degrees centigrade. Over West Siberia, minus 50 degrees centigrade. Over Latin America, minus 22 degrees centigrade, and so on.
Prison all nuclear production.
All the scientists who attended the forum emphasized the need to rid the world of nuclear weapons.
Make it, we expect some freezing of our planet. No choice in this case.
More weapons means less security. Less national security for the United States, less national security for the Soviet Union, less security for the planet Earth.
These images show the movement of clouds from January to July. And they were made by means of the Japanese meteorological satellite, Himawari. The white patterns appearing and disappearing are clouds indicating the movement of the atmosphere. From their movement, you can see that the Earth's atmosphere is clearly divided in two at the equator, north and south. The two systems move independently. This pattern of movement would change rapidly after a nuclear war. If, for example, a total nuclear war should break out on a day in July, how spread across the Earth? This is the normal globe on the 10th of July. A huge volume of smoke forming new atmospheric currents would invade the stratosphere, move over the equator, and flow into the southern hemisphere. The smoke would flow south through the stratosphere at a speed of nearly 11 kilometers per hour and cross into the southern hemisphere in 2 weeks. In about 1 month, the Earth would have altered its appearance and become a gray planet. With this layer of smoke particles circling the globe, the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface would be reduced by 99%. Heavy black clouds would hang low in the skies of the northern hemisphere, and day would resemble night with a full moon.
The sunlight comes and hits the smoke. Most of it's absorbed by the soot. It gets very hot.
Dr. Stephen Schneider, U.S. National Center for Atmospheric Research.
As you all know, when sunlight hits a blacktop road, you can see the warm air rising. Well, the same thing will happen. The warm air will start to rise above this this heated smoke cloud, and it'll start to go up toward the stratosphere, the area that's about 12 to 30 kilometers high. It'll start to heat the middle of the atmosphere so dramatically that it will begin to reverse the general direction of the winds, actually creating a large circulation cell rising from the mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere, going up 10 to 20 kilometers into the stratosphere, taking smoke both up and out and moving it toward the southern hemisphere.
This is the normal distribution of atmospheric temperatures in July. Areas colored blue are below zero. At present, they are limited to the polar regions. But after a nuclear war, the pattern begins to change. The second day. The fourth day. Blue sections appear in the inner areas of continents. The sixth day. And the eighth day. Temperatures over the land are dropping rapidly. At this point, all crops in the northern hemisphere will be destroyed. The 10th day. Europe, the Soviet Union, and North America fall under the grip of ice. The frozen air of the continents streams toward the sea areas, which are not yet so cold, building up into violent winds. From the interior of the land masses toward the sea, a long period of storms continues. The sudden winter brought about by nuclear war has been named by scientists the nuclear winter. And scientists have estimated that this nuclear winter could be triggered by only 0.5% of the nuclear warheads in the world today. 0.5%. 100 megatons, equivalent to the amount carried by only 5 strategic submarines. As the sea gets colder, the winds will weaken, and the sea areas close to the land will also freeze over. With the loss of sunlight, the phytoplankton that live in the sea will be the first to die out, followed by the fish that live on them, and they in turn by all the larger fish. Day by day, the areas with temperatures below zero will spread southward. Eventually, the deserts will freeze. On the 40th day after a July nuclear war, near the end of August, the temperatures in different parts of the world will be New York, minus 15 degrees Celsius. Paris, minus 20. Stockholm, minus 30. Moscow, minus 30. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, minus 16. New Delhi, minus 8. Tokyo, minus 5. And Toronto, minus 25 degrees Celsius. These figures are calculated from estimates made by Dr. Vladimir Alexandrov, head of the Department of Atmospheric Models, Soviet Academy of Sciences. According to one scholar, these wintry conditions will persist for 6 months. According to another, they will last for 3 years. If the nuclear winter lasts for even 1 year, the southern hemisphere will also freeze. The cold will destroy every crop, and people south of the equator, far from the nuclear battlefields, will face crisis and death. There are some 30 million species of animal and plant life on Earth, and half of them live in the tropical rainforests. Most life forms have a low tolerance toward changes in temperature, and whole species will die off if there is a drop of only a few degrees. The tropical rainforests will become, within a short period, forests of death, and will later change into vast deserts. This will mean the loss of one of the Earth's largest sources of oxygen. The last blows to fall will be poisonous gases and a deadly burst of ultraviolet radiation from the sun.
We have a problem in the stratosphere because in the stratosphere there is ozone. Ozone protects us from ultraviolet radiation.
Dr. Paul Crutzen, Max Planck Institute, West Germany.
Causes skin cancer and snow blindness and problems like that. That ozone may be attacked by pollutants which have been put into the atmosphere. So when the war is over and the aerosol particles have settled down on the Earth's surface, there may be reactions taking place in the stratosphere which reduce ozone. On the other hand, in the troposphere, we may have reactions starting which make ozone. And that's where we don't want ozone. We want ozone in the stratosphere, but not in the troposphere. Ozone in the troposphere would cause health problems. They would immediately interfere with breathing. It will attack plants, whatever plants are left in certain regions.
Harsh ultraviolet radiation and toxic gases. The blows that both these deliver will put living things in an even more precarious position. With the Earth having lost its covering, its plant life, the weather will show great extremes. It will be merciless. If the sun shines, it will mean drought. If it rains, there will be floods. The ground will be parched and cracked. Mountains will disintegrate, and sandstorms will rage. One scientist has predicted a return to the Stone Age, when the last traces of the nuclear holocaust are gone. Another has said the Earth will be the same as it was 600 million years ago, when primitive forms of life had just begun to appear, somewhat like the surface of the moon. Though man may not live through a nuclear war, scientists predict that certain animals could adapt, and will, like cockroaches. They live underground and in sheltered places, and are very resistant to radiation. If they survive, they will immediately increase their numbers. But no matter what life forms survive, it will be a world in which the civilization of today will have ceased to exist.
We are all humankind, and independently of our political attitudes, religious, ethnical, and other differences, we are united in the one idea to prevent the nuclear war. And
Dr. Marat Vartanyan, Director of Research Academy of Medical Sciences, Moscow.
Unity. I must say that during whole human history, about 5,000 years, the only 292 years, the Earth was free from wars. During these 5,000 years, approximately 1,590 global and local wars happened. And during these wars, there were about 4 billion casualties, equal to the whole population of the world. And the problem is that possible nuclear war would be the last one. There will be no winner, no loser. All humankind will end.
The population of the world today is 4.8 billion. Of this population, the number who will survive the Third World War for some time after will be about 1 billion, mainly in the southern hemisphere. But these survivors will immediately be threatened by extinction. Radiation sickness will spread to every part of the world, and epidemic diseases will be rampant. But there will be no medical services to tend to them. And with all this, the nuclear winter will continue. In the tropics, as well as in the north, food supplies will run out, and famine will close in, ending the final chapter. The sounds of children at play, the spring rains after the snows of winter, the love we share with others. Life speaks to us directly, whatever country we call home. And as citizens of the world, we're not so different in our desires to somehow shape our future to make it better for our children. Human life is so easily lost by the smallest event which could ignite the use of nuclear weapons. It will take only a moment, and our future will change irrevocably. Politicians for 30 years have been trying to put an end to the nuclear arms race, but so far they've failed. If it's to be stopped, it will be when the people of the world demand that it be stopped. The Third World War will be the last war. Together, we are responsible for making sure it never happens.
Todo